My name is William Thompson, and I'm 73 years old. For 35 years, I served as an elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, believing with every fiber of my being that I was part of God's chosen people. I gave everything to what they called the truth. My youth, my career prospects, my relationships with worldly family members, even my own critical thinking. I thought I was protecting the flock, shepherding God's people through these last days before Armageddon. But on a cold October evening in 1998, while organizing files in the back room of our Kingdom Hall in Millfield congregation, I stumbled upon something that would shatter my world completely. It was tucked between routine correspondence and meeting schedules, a manila envelope marked confidential, elders only, with the Watchtower Society's official seal. The paper inside was crisp, freshly typed, bearing the letterhead I had revered for decades. The title made my blood run cold: Guidelines for Handling Sensitive Allegations Within the Congregation. At first glance, I assumed it was guidance for helping victims of serious crimes. How naive I was. As I read those carefully crafted paragraphs, my hands began to tremble. This wasn't about helping anyone. It was a systematic instruction manual for covering up abuse and silencing victims. The document was chillingly precise. It outlined step-by-step procedures for suppressing any allegations that might bring reproach upon Jehovah's organization. It instructed elders to discourage victims from contacting authorities, to question their credibility, and to frame any disclosure as potential slander against God's appointed servants. There were specific phrases to use, psychological tactics to employ, and warnings about the spiritual dangers of pursuing legal action. Most horrifying of all, it explicitly stated that protecting the organization's reputation took precedence over individual welfare. I sat there in that dimly lit room, surrounded by publications that had shaped my entire adult life, feeling as though the ground beneath me was crumbling. This wasn't some rogue elder's twisted interpretation. This was official policy, sanctioned by the very men I believed spoke for God himself. My mind raced back through decades of memories, conversations where victims had been silenced, families torn apart, young people who had simply vanished from our congregation without explanation. Now I understood why. Those disappearances weren't random spiritual failings. They were the result of a deliberate system designed to protect predators and silence their victims. The weight of what I was holding hit me like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at me to put it back, to pretend I'd never seen it, to continue living in the comfortable lie I had inhabited for so long. But I couldn't unsee those words. I couldn't unknow what I now knew. With shaking hands, I carefully made a photocopy using the office machine, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain someone would hear it. As I folded that copy and slipped it into my jacket pocket, I realized I was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Walking home that night through the familiar streets of our small town, everything looked different. The Kingdom Hall that had been my second home for decades now felt like a facade hiding terrible secrets. The brothers and sisters I had served alongside for years, how many of them knew about this document? How many had used it? How many victims had they silenced while I remained blissfully ignorant, believing we were doing God's work? The questions tormented me as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing that my life as I had known it was over. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a stranger. The confident elder who had given talks about integrity and truth was gone, replaced by a man carrying the weight of a devastating secret. I thought about my late wife, Margaret, who had died believing she was part of God's organization. I thought about my son, James, who had been disfellowshipped years earlier for questioning doctrine and whom I had shunned according to organizational instructions. Had he been right all along? The possibility made me physically ill. For days, I carried that document like a burning coal in my pocket. During meetings, I watched my fellow elders with new eyes, wondering which of them had received similar instructions, which of them had implemented these cruel policies. When Brother Anderson gave his talk about the importance of keeping the congregation clean, I thought about the victims who had been sacrificed on the altar of organizational reputation. When Sister Mitchell shared her testimony about how the organization had saved her life, I wondered how many lives it had actually destroyed through its systematic cover-ups. The weeks following my discovery passed in a blur of mounting anxiety and sleepless nights. I found myself scrutinizing every interaction, every meeting, every casual conversation with fellow elders through this new lens of awareness. The document remained hidden in my home office, tucked behind a loose board I had discovered years earlier while doing repairs. But its contents haunted me every waking moment, replaying in my mind like a broken record that wouldn't stop spinning. During our weekly elders' meetings, I sat quietly in the back room of the Kingdom Hall, listening to discussions about congregation matters with growing horror. When Brother Patterson mentioned that young Rebecca Williams had been asking uncomfortable questions about her stepfather's behavior, the other elders immediately shifted into damage control mode. "We need to be careful about how we handle this," Brother Daniel said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of authority I had once found comforting. "We can't let wild accusations disrupt the peace of the congregation." Dale, the parallels to the document's instructions were unmistakable, and I felt sick to my stomach. I watched as they systematically dismantled Rebecca's credibility before even investigating her claims. They questioned her spiritual maturity, suggested she might be seeking attention, and reminded everyone present about the biblical requirement for 2 witnesses to any wrongdoing. The irony was suffocating. Here was an organization that claimed to follow Christ's example of protecting the innocent, yet their first instinct was to protect the reputation of a potential predator. The meeting ended with a decision to counsel Rebecca about making unfounded accusations and to monitor her for signs of rebellious thinking. That night, I couldn't bear to look at my own reflection. I had participated in this system for decades, believing I was serving God while actually serving an institution that prioritized its image over justice. How many Rebecca Williams had there been over the years? How many young voices had been silenced while I nodded along, convinced we were maintaining theocratic order? The guilt was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. I couldn't continue being complicit in this systematic abuse of power. My attempts to sleep were interrupted by vivid nightmares where victims confronted me, asking why I had remained silent, why I had chosen the organization over their suffering. I would wake up drenched in sweat, Margaret's empty side of the bed serving as a stark reminder of my isolation. During the day, I found myself unable to concentrate on routine tasks. My pioneering schedule suffered as I spent hours walking aimlessly through town, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. The document had mentioned specific legal strategies for avoiding law enforcement involvement, techniques for discouraging victims from seeking outside help, and methods for framing any external intervention as persecution from Satan's world. Reading those clinical instructions, I realized that every aspect of this cover-up had been carefully planned and implemented across thousands of congregations worldwide. This wasn't the work of a few corrupt individuals. This was institutional policy at the highest levels. 3 weeks after finding the document, I received an unexpected visit from Brother Harrison, the circuit overseer responsible for our region. His presence in our small congregation, outside of his scheduled visits, was unusual, and his demeanor seemed more serious than his typical friendly pastoral calls. "William," he said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table, "I've been hearing some concerning reports about questions being raised in your congregation. Questions about how we handle certain sensitive matters." My heart hammered against my ribs as I maintained what I hoped was a calm expression. "I'm not sure what you mean, Brother Harrison," I replied. though every instinct told me this visit was connected to my discovery. He leaned forward, his eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. There are those who would seek to undermine the faith of God's people by spreading doubts about our procedures. Sometimes well-meaning brothers can inadvertently become tools of the adversary by entertaining such doubts. The conversation continued for another hour, with Brother Harrison speaking in the coded language that organizational representatives used when delivering warnings. He never directly accused me of anything, but his message was crystal clear. I was being watched, and any deviation from absolute loyalty would be noted and acted upon. As he prepared to leave, he placed his hand on my shoulder with what appeared to be fatherly concern. "Remember, William, Satan often attacks those who have served faithfully for many years. Don't let him use your own conscience against you." After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the spot where he had been sitting. The visit confirmed my worst fears. Somehow they suspected I had seen something I shouldn't have. Whether through surveillance, informants, or simply the paranoid efficiency that characterized the organization's internal security, my discovery had not gone unnoticed. The walls were closing in, and I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. That evening, as I sat in my study, surrounded by decades of Watchtower literature, I made a decision that terrified and liberated me simultaneously. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing a detailed account of everything I had witnessed, every cover-up I had participated in, every victim I had failed to protect. The words flowed like water from a broken dam, years of suppressed guilt and growing awareness pouring onto the pages. By dawn, I had filled 12 pages with testimony that could destroy the carefully constructed facade of the organization I had served so faithfully. But before I could act on this newfound courage, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. The document I had found was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and I suspected there were others who had discovered similar evidence. My isolation was about to end, though not in any way I could have anticipated. You know, my dear friends, sharing these memories with you feels like lifting a weight I've carried for far too long. Sometimes I wonder if you, sitting there listening to an old man's story, can truly understand the depth of betrayal I felt, the complete shattering of everything I thought I knew about truth and justice. But somehow, in telling you this, I feel less alone with these memories. If you're still with me on this journey, it would mean the world to this old heart if you'd let me know in the comments below. Your presence here, listening to these difficult truths, gives me strength to continue. This story isn't easy to tell, but it's one that needs telling, and knowing you're there makes all the difference. The turning point came 3 days after Brother Harrison's ominous visit, when I encountered someone I never expected to see again. Sarah Martinez had been disfellowshipped from our congregation 2 years earlier for what the elders termed causing divisions and spreading negative talk about the organization. I remembered the Judicial Committee meeting vividly. She had tried desperately to tell us about inappropriate conduct by Brother Stevens, one of our most respected ministerial servants, but we had dismissed her claims as the desperate lies of someone trying to avoid accountability for her own spiritual failures. I was leaving the grocery store when I nearly collided with her in the parking lot. According to organizational policy, I should have looked away, avoided any acknowledgement of her existence. Disfellowshipped individuals were to be treated as though they were dead, completely shunned until they demonstrated sufficient repentance to warrant reinstatement. But something in her eyes stopped me cold. Instead of the broken, defeated woman I expected to see, Sarah looked stronger somehow, more at peace than I remembered her being even during her most active years as a pioneer. "Hello, William," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the bitterness I had anticipated. "I heard about Margaret's passing. I'm sorry for your loss." The simple kindness in her words, after everything we had put her through, hit me like a physical blow. Here was someone we had cast out, destroyed socially and emotionally, yet she was offering genuine condolences for my grief. The contrast between her compassion and the cold institutional cruelty I had recently discovered was overwhelming. Against every rule I had followed for decades, I found myself responding, "Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, both aware that this conversation could have serious consequences for me if reported to the elders. But something compelled me to continue. "Sarah, about what happened during your committee meeting. I've been doing some thinking lately about how we handled things." Her expression shifted, surprise replacing wariness. "William, are you all right? You look like you haven't slept in weeks." The concern in her voice was genuine, and I realized that this woman I had helped destroy was showing me more care than any of my fellow elders had in recent months. Without fully understanding why, I found myself asking if we could talk somewhere private. The risk was enormous. Being seen in extended conversation with a disfellowshipped person could result in my own removal from privilege, or worse. We drove separately to a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from the congregation. As we sat across from each other in a corner booth, I struggled with how to begin. The document hidden in my home office felt like it was burning a hole through my consciousness, but revealing its existence would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Yet looking at Sarah, remembering how we had silenced her, I knew I had to speak. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that I'm asking because I'm beginning to understand that we may have been wrong about many things." My voice was barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile trust was building between us. "When you tried to tell us about Brother Stevens, were you telling the truth?" The question hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of years of injustice and institutional blindness. Tears welled up in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "William, I knew that coming forward would cost me everything. My family, my friends, my entire social world. Everything I had ever known was tied to that congregation. Do you really think I would have destroyed my own life over a lie?" The pain in her words was palpable, but there was also a strength there that I was only beginning to understand. What Brother Stevens did to me wasn't just inappropriate conduct. It was systematic abuse that continued for months. And when I finally found the courage to speak up, you and the other elders made me feel like I was the criminal. As Sarah recounted the details of her experience, I felt physically ill. The pattern was identical to what I had read in the document, questioning the victim's motives, demanding impossible levels of proof, framing any resistance as spiritual weakness or outright rebellion. We had followed those instructions to the letter, destroying an innocent woman's life to protect a predator and preserve the organization's reputation. The weight of my complicity was crushing. "There's something else you should know," Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Brother Stevens didn't stop after I was disfellowshipped. I've been in contact with 3 other women who've had similar experiences with him. One of them is still in the congregation, too terrified to speak up after seeing what happened to me. Another moved to a different state to escape the situation. They all thought they were alone, that no one would believe them. The revelation that there were other victims, that our failure to act had enabled continued abuse, made me feel like I was drowning in shame." But Sarah wasn't finished. "William, I know this is difficult to hear, but Brother Stevens isn't the only one. There's a network of women, some current members, some disfellowshipped, some who simply faded away, who've been sharing their stories quietly. The pattern is always the same: abuse by men in positions of authority, institutional cover-up, and victim silencing." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. This wasn't isolated incidents or rare exceptions. This was systematic abuse enabled by the very policies I had helped enforce. The document I had found wasn't an aberration. It was standard operating procedure implemented across the organization with devastating effectiveness. The scope of the betrayal was beyond anything I had imagined. "Sarah," I said finally, my voice cracking with emotion, "I need to show you something. But first, I need you to understand that what I'm about to share with you could put us both in serious danger." Her eyes widened, but she nodded without hesitation. "I recently discovered a document that explains exactly why we handled your case the way we did. It's not because we were incompetent or misguided. It's because we were following official instructions designed to cover up exactly the kind of abuse you experienced." The conversation that followed changed both of our lives forever. When I described the document's contents, Sarah's face went through a range of emotions: pain, anger, but ultimately, vindication. For the first time in 2 years, she had confirmation that her treatment hadn't been the result of some personal failing or spiritual weakness. It had been deliberate, systematic, and sanctioned at the highest levels of the organization. As we prepared to leave the diner, Sarah made a proposal that terrified and thrilled me simultaneously. "William, if you're serious about exposing this, you're not alone. There are others who've been waiting for someone with your credibility and access to step forward. We've been collecting testimonies, documenting patterns, building a case, but we needed someone from the inside, someone who couldn't be dismissed as a disgruntled former member." The drive home felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream where everything familiar had become strange and threatening. I had crossed a line that afternoon that would forever separate my life into before and after. There was no going back to the comfortable ignorance I had enjoyed for so many years. The truth I had discovered was spreading, finding others who had been waiting in the shadows for someone to speak up. That night, I pulled out the hidden document again, but this time I wasn't reading it alone. In my mind, I could hear Sarah's voice and the voices of all the other victims she had mentioned. The clinical language that had seemed so shocking when I first read it now seemed even more sinister, knowing how it had been used to destroy real lives, real families, real faith. But for the first time since finding it, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope, and I felt the beginning of a plan. The following week brought a series of clandestine meetings that opened my eyes to a reality I had never imagined. Sarah had arranged for me to meet with others who had been silenced by the organization's systematic cover-up policies, and what I discovered was both heartbreaking and empowering. We gathered in the basement of an old community center on the other side of town, far from any place where congregation members might accidentally encounter us. The precautions felt dramatic, but as I would soon learn, they were absolutely necessary. The first person Sarah introduced me to was Michael Brennan, a former ministerial servant from a congregation 3 towns over. His story was remarkably similar to mine. A faithful organization man for over 20 years who had stumbled upon evidence of institutional cover-ups and found himself unable to remain silent. Michael had discovered financial documents showing that his congregation had paid significant sums to silence abuse victims, money that came from the very contributions that faithful members believed were funding worldwide preaching work. When I questioned the circuit overseer about these payments, Michael told our small group, his voice still carrying traces of the pain he had endured, I was immediately labeled as spiritually weak and potentially dangerous to the congregation's unity. Within 3 months, I was stripped of all privileges and marked as bad association. They never disfellowshipped me officially, but they made my life so unbearable that leaving was my only option. Next, I met Jennifer Walsh, whose teenage daughter had been abused by an elder in their congregation. Jennifer's attempts to seek justice had been met with the full force of the organization's intimidation tactics. They told me that pursuing legal action would bring reproach on Jehovah's name, she explained, tears streaming down her face as she recounted her experience. They said that if I truly trusted in God, I would leave the matter in His hands and wait for Him to handle it in His own time. Meanwhile, the elder who abused my daughter continued serving, continued having access to other children. The most shocking revelation came from Robert Chen, a former Bethelite who had worked at the organization's headquarters for nearly a decade. Robert had been part of the legal department and had first-hand knowledge of how abuse cases were handled at the highest levels. "There are filing cabinets full of documented abuse cases," he told us, his voice barely above a whisper despite our secure location. "Detailed reports, witness statements, even confessions, all buried to protect the organization's public image. I personally saw correspondence where branch offices were instructed to destroy potentially damaging documents rather than risk them being discovered during legal proceedings. As each person shared their story, I began to understand that the document I had found was just one small piece of a massive, coordinated effort to suppress truth and protect predators. The organization had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and neutralizing potential whistleblowers, often before they could cause any real damage to its reputation. Former members were systematically discredited through campaigns of character assassination, their mental health questioned, their motives portrayed as bitter revenge against God's chosen organization. Sarah had been working for over 2 years to document these patterns and connect isolated victims with others who had similar experiences. Through careful networking and the anonymous sharing of stories, she had uncovered evidence of abuse cover-ups spanning multiple states and involving hundreds of cases. The scope was staggering, but so was the organizational response whenever anyone tried to expose it. "They have lawyers, private investigators, and a propaganda machine that can destroy anyone who threatens them," she explained during a break in our meeting. Robert provided the most disturbing insight into how the system actually operated. At headquarters, there's an entire department dedicated to what they call reputation management. They monitor former members, track potential legal threats, and coordinate responses to any negative publicity. When someone like William discovers damaging documents, they know about it within days, sometimes hours. The visit you received from Brother Harrison wasn't coincidental. It was part of a carefully orchestrated response designed to intimidate you into silence. The revelation that my discovery had triggered such immediate attention was both terrifying and validating. It confirmed that the document I had found was genuinely dangerous to the organization, significant enough to warrant immediate damage control measures. But it also meant that every person in that basement was likely under some form of surveillance, their communications monitored, their activities tracked by people who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints about how they used them. Michael had brought copies of financial records that painted a disturbing picture of how the organization allocated its resources. Millions of dollars that could have been used for legitimate humanitarian work were instead funneled into legal settlements, private investigations, and sophisticated public relations campaigns designed to discredit abuse victims. "They have more lawyers than most major corporations," he explained, spreading documents across the table. "And those lawyers aren't working to help abuse victims, they're working to silence them." The meeting continued for nearly 4 hours as we shared information and began to understand the true magnitude of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just a religious organization trying to avoid embarrassment. This was a multi-billion-dollar corporation using every tool at its disposal to protect its interests and neutralize threats. The methods they employed were sophisticated and ruthless, involving psychological manipulation, legal intimidation, and systematic character assassination of anyone who dared to speak out. Jennifer had brought audio recordings of judicial committee meetings where victims were questioned about their abuse in ways specifically designed to discredit their testimony. The recordings were deeply disturbing, revealing how elders used religious authority and psychological pressure to convince victims that seeking justice was tantamount to betraying God. They told my daughter that if she pursued legal action, She would be responsible for stumbling thousands of faithful witnesses who might lose their faith if they learned about problems in the organization. As our meeting drew to a close, Sarah presented a proposal that would change everything. She had been in contact with investigative journalists who specialized in exposing institutional abuse and cover-ups. These reporters had the resources and protection necessary to tell our story in a way that couldn't be easily suppressed or discredited. But they needed more than isolated testimonies. They needed documentary evidence that could withstand legal challenges and sophisticated disinformation campaigns. "William," Sarah said, looking directly at me, "that document you found could be the key to everything. It's official organizational policy, bearing their letterhead and seal. Combined with the testimonies we've collected and the financial records Michael has provided, it could finally expose the truth in a way that can't be ignored or explained away." The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. I was being asked to become the central figure in what could be the most significant expose of organizational corruption in decades. Robert warned us about the likely response if we proceeded. Once this story breaks, they'll unleash everything they have. Private investigators will dig into every aspect of our personal lives. They'll find any mistake we've ever made, any weakness we've ever shown, and use it to destroy our credibility. Former friends and family members will be turned against us. They'll paint us as mentally unstable apostates driven by bitterness and revenge. The prospect was terrifying, but as I looked around the room at these brave people who had already sacrificed everything for truth, I knew there was no turning back. That night, driving home through familiar streets that now felt foreign and threatening, I understood that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. The document hidden in my home office was no longer just evidence of institutional corruption. It was a weapon that could potentially bring down decades of carefully constructed lies and cover-ups. The question was whether I had the courage to use it, knowing that doing so would make me a target of forces far more powerful and ruthless than anything I had ever faced before. The decision to go public came 2 weeks after that basement meeting, triggered by an event that made continued silence impossible. I was contacted by Detective Maria Rodriguez from the County Sheriff's Department, who was investigating historical abuse cases connected to religious organizations in our area. Someone had provided her with my name as a potential witness, and she wanted to discuss what I might know about policies regarding the reporting of suspected crimes within Jehovah's Witness congregations. Sitting across from Detective Rodriguez, in the sterile interview room at the police station, I felt the full weight of 35 years of complicity pressing down on me. She was professional but persistent, asking specific questions about how our judicial committees operated, whether we had ever discouraged crime victims from contacting law enforcement, and what official guidance we received from the Watchtower organization regarding these matters. With each question, the document hidden in my home office seemed to burn brighter in my memory. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Rodriguez said, leaning forward slightly, "we have testimony from multiple victims indicating that congregation elders actively discouraged them from reporting serious crimes to authorities. We also have evidence suggesting that known predators were transferred between congregations without warnings being given to parents in the receiving congregations. I need to know if you have any knowledge of policies or procedures that would support these allegations." Udi, the moment had arrived when I could no longer hide behind willful ignorance or organizational loyalty. Looking into Detective Rodriguez's eyes, seeing the genuine concern for victims that I had somehow lost during my decades of institutional service, I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. "Detective, I have a document that I believe will answer all of your questions. But before I share it, I need you to understand that doing so will likely destroy what remains of my life as I've known it." 3 days later, accompanied by Sarah and Michael, I returned to the police station with photocopies of the document and a detailed written statement describing everything I had witnessed and participated in during my years as an elder. Detective Rodriguez's reaction upon reading the organizational instructions for suppressing abuse reports was immediate and visceral. "My God," she whispered, her professional composure cracking momentarily. "This is a systematic conspiracy to obstruct justice. We're not talking about isolated incidents or individual bad actors. This is institutional policy designed to protect criminals." The document provided the missing piece that investigators had been seeking for months. Combined with victim testimonies and financial records that Michael had provided, it painted an undeniable picture of organized criminal activity operating under the protection of religious freedom. Within hours of our meeting, Detective Rodriguez was coordinating with federal authorities who had been conducting parallel investigations in other states. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and our local evidence was part of a much larger pattern of abuse and cover-up. The organizational response was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours of my visit to the police station, I received a phone call from Brother Harrison informing me that I was being summoned to an emergency judicial committee meeting. The charges were serious, causing divisions in the congregation, bringing reproach upon Jehovah's organization, and most damning of all, apostasy for working with Satan's system against God's people. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening, barely giving me time to prepare for what I knew would be a kangaroo court designed to destroy my reputation and discredit my testimony. I spent that night writing letters to my son James, whom I had shunned for years due to his own conflicts with the organization, and to my late wife's sister Ruth, who had remained faithful despite witnessing the institutional cruelty that had driven James away. In those letters, I tried to explain the journey that had brought me to this point, the discoveries that had shattered my faith in human religious authority, while somehow strengthening my faith in basic human decency and justice. I knew these might be the last communications I could have with family members before being formally cast out. The judicial committee meeting was held in the same back room where I had found the document that started this journey. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat facing three men I had worked alongside for years, men who were now tasked with destroying me to protect the organization we had all served. Brother Harrison had been joined by two other circuit-level officials, indicating that my case was being handled as a serious threat requiring significant organizational attention. The proceedings were a masterclass in psychological manipulation and religious intimidation. They began by expressing sorrow for my spiritual decline and offering me multiple opportunities to come to my senses and repent for my rebellious actions. When I refused to back down, their tone shifted to barely concealed hostility. They accused me of being motivated by pride, bitterness, and a desire for worldly acclaim. They suggested that Satan was using my grief over Margaret's death to cloud my judgment and turn me against God's organization. "William," Brother Harrison said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I had heard him use with other spiritually weak individuals, "you've allowed the enemies of God's people to manipulate you into betraying your own spiritual family. These worldly authorities you're cooperating with don't care about truth or justice. They only want to destroy faith and corrupt the minds of God's people. You're being used as a tool of Satan, and you're too spiritually blind to see it." Vuku, when they demanded that I recant my testimony to police and publicly apologize for bringing reproach upon the organization, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. Standing up in that small room, surrounded by publications that had once represented absolute truth to me, I spoke words that felt like they were coming from somewhere deeper than my own consciousness. "Brothers, I've spent 35 years following men who claim to speak for God. I've silenced victims, protected predators, and prioritized institutional reputation over human suffering, all because I believed I was serving a higher purpose. But I finally learned the difference between serving God and serving an organization that merely claims to represent Him. The disfellowshipping announcement was made the following Sunday during the service meeting. As was customary, it was brief and clinical. William Thompson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Those 8 words effectively erased my entire adult identity and severed every meaningful relationship I had maintained within the organization. Friends I had known for decades suddenly couldn't acknowledge my existence. The pharmacist who had filled Margaret's prescriptions during her final illness now looked through me as though I were invisible. The mailman who had attended our congregation for 20 years crossed the street to avoid walking past my house. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following my excommunication. Instead of the crushing isolation I had feared, I began receiving contact from people I had never expected to hear from again. Former congregation members who had been disfellowshipped or had faded away began reaching out, sharing their own stories of institutional abuse and offering support. My son James called for the first time in 5 years, his voice breaking as he said, "Dad, I'm proud of you for finally choosing what's right over what's easy." Detective Rodriguez kept me informed about the progress of the investigation, which had expanded to include federal prosecutors and investigators from multiple states. The document I had provided was being used as evidence in criminal cases against individual predators and civil cases against the organization itself. Victims who had been silenced for years were finding the courage to come forward, knowing that their testimonies would be supported by documentary evidence of institutional cover-up policies. 6 months after my disfellowshipping, I stood in a federal courthouse as a key witness in the first of what would become dozens of criminal prosecutions. Looking out at the packed courtroom, seeing survivors sitting next to their families, seeing Detective Rodriguez and the team of prosecutors who had taken our evidence seriously, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. The organization had taken away my identity, my community, and my sense of belonging, but they couldn't take away the knowledge that I had finally done the right thing. The media coverage was extensive and devastating for the organization. Headlines in major newspapers detailed the systematic cover-up policies, the financial settlements paid to silence victims, and the sophisticated intimidation tactics used against whistleblowers. The document I had found was reproduced in full in several publications, its clinical language providing undeniable proof of institutional conspiracy to obstruct justice. For the first time in decades, the organization couldn't control the narrative or discredit the evidence through character assassination. My testimony in court lasted 3 days, during which I detailed not only the contents of the document, but also my personal experiences implementing those policies over the course of my elder service. The defense attorneys did their best to portray me as a bitter former member seeking revenge, but the documentary evidence spoke for itself. When cross-examination focused on my motivations for coming forward, I looked directly at the jury and said, "I spent most of my adult life protecting an institution that I believed represented God. It took me far too long to realize that protecting God's reputation never requires covering up crimes against children." As I sit here now, 5 years later, reflecting on the journey that brought me from faithful organizational servant to public whistleblower, I'm struck by how much my understanding of faith and courage has evolved. The organization taught me that faith meant unquestioning obedience to human authority, and that courage meant defending institutional interests regardless of personal cost. But real faith, I've learned, means following your conscience even when it leads you away from everything you thought you believed. Real courage means protecting the vulnerable even when doing so destroys your own security and comfort. My friends, if you've stayed with me through this entire difficult journey, I want you to know how much your presence means to an old man who learned too late what really matters in this life. The comments you've left, The messages of support, the stories you've shared about your own struggles with institutional authority, they've given me strength during some very dark moments. This community we've built together, based on truth and mutual support rather than unquestioning obedience, feels more genuine than anything I experienced in 35 years of organizational service. Please, keep sharing your stories in the comments below. Let others know they're not alone in questioning, in seeking truth, in choosing conscience over convenience. Your voice matters, your experiences are valid, and together we can continue exposing the systems that prey on faith and trust. Thank you for giving this old whistleblower a place to finally tell his truth.